Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today, my guest is Julian Lindley-French, quite a famous British strategist, a professor, the chairman of the Alphen Group. And I would enumerate here for like 1 hour if I would have to mention all the titles and posts that he has ever held. But we agreed that I will make it short. So I'm just making it short. Hi, Julian. How are you?
Hi, very well. Yes, great to be with you. It's a real honor to do this. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Of course, likewise. Before we start recording, we agreed that we would touch all those most important topics that have sort of transpired recently, starting from Afghanistan and Kabul and Biden's decision to withdraw despite, operational situation on ground, and famous submarine deal for Australia, the UK positioning after Brexit, the new game on the continent. That's a beautiful British phrase, I hope. And how he sees the future after the German election for the West. Do we still have the West as a unified geostrategic concept? And will that be so going forward to the future? So, the full plethora of subjects. Start with whatever you want, Julian.
Well, let's start with Afghanistan, because in many ways that's been the trigger of recent tensions. I wrote 3 major reports for commanders. I went to Afghanistan. I looked at the situation on the ground. There were many mistakes made at the operational level, but an awful lot of good was achieved, as I saw on the ground. But the ultimate failure of Afghanistan was one of a lack of political will, and not just in Washington. Almost since 2008, with the financial crisis, in many of our countries, I felt the political backing for the campaign in Afghanistan evaporating. I do believe we could have made far more progress had we been better organized, had we been much more cohesive in the way that we deployed our forces in Afghanistan, had the stabilization and reconstruction campaigns that ran in parallel been more effective, and had there been a much closer alignment between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, as well as a regional strategy. We could have done far more. So it's a myth to suggest that we had huge numbers of Western forces tied down in Afghanistan. In fact, the numbers became lower and lower. The fundamental American mistake, in my mind, was to tie the development of the Afghan national security forces, particularly the Afghan National Army, to an American core. Once that core was withdrawn, almost overnight, it was almost inevitable that force, which was a work in progress, would collapse. What we lacked, I remember, it's a cliche, but I had the phrase used at me in Afghanistan, which is, you have the watches, i.e. the West has the watches, but we have the time, i.e. the Taliban had the time. And it was true. We lacked strategic patience. We lacked the will to carry this through. Most Europeans were there not to succeed in Afghanistan, but to do just enough to keep the Americans engaged in European security defense in the wake of 9/11. So there was never really a sense of a unified, cohesive effort to stabilize the country. The Americans made profound mistakes as well. I mean, some of the people they brought into government had been part of the problem in the 1990s and were always going to be part of the problem in Afghanistan. Beyond Kabul, there was little belief amongst the people in the provinces that they could trust Kabul. So there was a whole plethora of reasons why Afghanistan, the campaign, failed. But ultimately, it was a lack of political leadership in our capitals and a lack of transatlantic cohesion, which, from my analysis, critically undermined our progress in that country and leads to a tragic situation, Jacek, in which the prestige of the West has been profoundly damaged, which the strategic autonomies, the likes of Russia and China, will exploit at our expense. And we should be under no illusion about that.
Yeah, but let's try to be even more granular in understanding the situation. And let me ask some controversial questions.
Please.
Maybe it was so that there was such an asymmetry of interest and attention that Afghanistan is far away, landlocked, far away from the core interests of US and the allies. That, the longer it took, the more distant some political objective was, given the fact that there was no definite political objectives. Maybe West is always, as Russians claim, the West have a very strong military punch, but it always fails to deliver a proper calibrated political objective for war, as it was in case of Vietnam, even both Iraq wars and elsewhere. Maybe this is a sort of always a problem with the democratic societies and the strategic culture that it produces, that is so difficult to calibrate political objective. Yeah, it's either like during the Second and First World War, kill them all, so to speak, and impose occupation or Versailles Treaty, right, or the dissolution of the German state and partitioning of it after the Second World War. Or we don't know how much is enough, so to speak. That's question number one, and maybe that was the final problem, and that might not be good for the future, so to speak. And the second thing is that maybe United States is tired, overstretched. Afghanistan was not its primary business, and the rise of China is creating such a challenge for US. Not to mention the whole West, and US is already preoccupied that there is no unity between continental Europeans and US in that respect, that the challenges of the Western Pacific in terms of the military challenges are really daunting, and so on and so forth. And maybe that was a reasonable decision to shorten the front, withdraw to the world ocean using the old, cliche of Mackinder and Spikeman's phrases. Base yourself on UK, Australia, and its navy, maybe space capabilities in the future, and try to face this new reality in that way. Transform NATO and so on. What is your take on that?
Well, the latter part of your assertion I would agree with. The Americans are tired. But, even if they've shifted from a kind of winning two simultaneous war strategy to a defend in the Indo-Pacific to a deter in Europe, we could have maintained the campaign in Afghanistan and done all the other things. The problem was we began in 2001, 2002 with a fundamental disagreement over strategy. The Americans wanted to focus on a counterterrorism operation, Operation Enduring Freedom. The Europeans would go to Afghanistan under the NATO mandate eventually. But under the Bonn Agreement of 2002, what they wanted to do was nation building. So you had the Americans investing huge amounts of resources in the early years of the Afghanistan campaign, but not really believing in nation building. Whereas the Europeans who believed in nation building, not investing anything like the resources required to make it happen. The paradox is that the West is pretty good at big war. And we've seen in the past, when there are clear objectives like defeating Nazi Germany, as you Poles painfully are aware, or resisting Soviet aggression during the Cold War. We're pretty good at that when it involves, the big issues. And historically, we've also been very good at nation building, stabilization and reconstruction, if I could be controversial, because we called it empire. My own country, Britain, was for 400 years very successful in building an empire. Whatever you think about its rights and wrongs today, and as an Oxford historian, I don't tend to ascribe the values of today to the past. One of the first things I was taught at Oxford as a historian. But as European democracies, there's something deeper going on here, which is, I think, a denial about the nature of the world in which Europeans are living, and a failure, particularly in the Western European powers, much more so than in Poland or other European states, that it's a kind of strategic decadence, a kind of strategic illiteracy, that whatever was going on in Afghanistan, they just wanted out. They wanted out from the very beginning. which critically, and with the exception of the British, who did go down to Helmand and Kandahar and did lose a lot of people, if you look at the rules of engagement of most European forces, these were not countries going there to succeed. These were countries going there to pretend to be there. And the result was a kind of dissonance in the whole campaign, which I think was a premonition, a harbinger of what we see today in the dissonance between the Americans and their European allies inside NATO. This was a Europe that was obsessed with Europe, obsessed with itself, obsessed with institution building in the European Union and the balances of power implicit in that. It was a Europe that didn't want to look beyond the Euro world. And it found that its presence in Afghanistan was increasingly at odds with that Euro focus. And it was desperate for the Americans to pull the plug. They wouldn't pull the plug themselves on the Afghanistan campaign because that would have been potentially damaging to free riding on the Americans inside NATO, because the Americans might have become extremely unhappy with this, given what happened on 9/11. But make no mistake, they were desperate to get out. And so when you go into a campaign, cutting your armed forces, as many Europeans did, particularly after the financial and economic crisis, with no clear commitment or political will to succeed, and there were definitions of what success would look like in Afghanistan, then I'm afraid, given my involvement throughout the entire process, you're almost doomed to fail. So it's that lack of political will, which I think is precisely what President Putin and President Xi have picked up on, which is perhaps the most dangerous legacy of the failure in Afghanistan. And it is a failure. Let's be blunt about that.
Yeah, I would wish to elaborate more on this lack of the Europeans' will to sort of face the real world with the hard power issues and so on. I will promise to get back to it, which is highly important also for Poland,
sure,
my country. But I would like to conclude this Afghanistan thing with the following question. People claim around the world that the U.S. credibility has eroded because how it was, conducted, this withdrawal and so on, then the Kabul evacuations. But still, when I talk to the Americans, they claim that it's not going to happen because they will manage the credibility crisis, as still that the United States will emerge even stronger after drawing down in Afghanistan. Because of shortening the front and so on, and the Europeans and others will digest it, and will come through. Will sort of will have to come to terms with that, and the US will be stronger. So they are not afraid of the credibility crisis that you sort of touched upon a little bit, speaking about Xi Jinping and Putin, as sort of trying to exploit the potential of credibility. How would you balance this out?
Look, America's. I've heard this narrative, and as you know, I'm a strong supporter of our alliance. Absolutely strong supporter of our alliance. But America cannot defy strategic economic gravity. It has deep debt. It has profound divisions inside its society. It is tired of carrying the burdens of the West. We Europeans really have been free riding for far too long. And on top of that, the Russians and the Chinese in particular have worked out how to make America's life complicated. So whereas China is building up a navy, for example, that is bigger than the US Navy now, it's concentrated in East Asia, in the South China Sea. Russia has been rebuilding its forces, but they're concentrated. Now, the problem for the Americans is they've got a whole raft of domestic issues they've got to deal with, not least rebuilding their infrastructure, which if you go to America, as you do, Jacek and I do, it's tired compared with much of Europe, certainly much of Western Europe. They've got to rebuild that. They almost need a new deal, going back to Roosevelt's early years. And at the same time, they've got to cope with armed forces that have got to be stretched all over the world, that have to be credible in strength everywhere, all of the time, for deterrence to work in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific. And if I'm sitting in Beijing or Moscow, I'm thinking, well, I can make life extremely complicated for these guys. I can make them increasingly overstretched, including the Arctic, for example. I've just finished a big report for the European Parliament on the EU and Arctic security. It's quite frightening what's happening in the Arctic. What are the change agents in America's strategy to make it work? Well, it's Europeans. We're the rich group of countries and allies who could step up to the plate to ease the pressure on the United States and demonstrate our commitment to our relationship with them and a broader security strategic vision that we lack. But are we going to do it? Given the results what happened last night in Germany, I doubt it. Given the splits, post-Brexit splits between the UK and much of the rest of the continent, I doubt it.
Would you be more specific in both those issues that might be interesting for the audience? What is your assessment?
I mean, if the SPD have won, which by German electoral standards, if not a decisive, is a fairly clear, well, I won't call it victory, but superiority over the CDU. At 25.7% of the vote compared with 24.1%, then they're going to be in the lead of building a coalition. I cannot believe an SPD-led coalition is going to want to be strong on defense and to ease the lamentable state of the Bundeswehr, which is in an appalling state, which, given the overstretch of American forces, will have to become the central pillar of land deterrence of NATO in Europe. It's I hope I'm proved wrong, but I would doubt it. I think a CDU coalition might not be particularly keen on solving the German dilemma at the heart of NATO's continental defense. The British have all effectively withdrawn from the continent. Yeah, we've got a few forces in the enhanced forward presence, but by and large, what was the British Army of the Rhine? I was head of the Commanders Initiative Group of Comarch, the commander of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps when it was based at Rheindahlen in Germany. That's now been withdrawn to Gloucestershire. The British are investing huge amounts in the Royal Navy. We have the 2 new aircraft carriers. As we speak, 4 new Dreadnought-class ballistic nuclear missile submarines are being built. Last week, HMS Audacious, the latest Astute-class nuclear attack submarine, was commissioned by the Royal Navy. We're building brand new Type 26 frigates and Type 31 frigates. So we're rebuilding the Navy, which shows you where our priorities are, which is maritime amphibious, because we're an island. Look at a map. But if the world's 5th largest defense spender, the UK, which is going to increase its defense budget by 10% over the next 4 years, is effectively leaving the defense of continental Europe, and if Europe's strongest economy refuses to step up and make its own Bundeswehr the core component of the land deterrent of Europe, which it was, by the way, for much of the Cold War, the Bundeswehr was the biggest single force, then we have a real problem, which is the Brits are going in one direction and the Germans are going in a different one. And if I was a Pole, I'd be very concerned about this. The French, well, we all know that President Macron is going to take over the presidency of the European Union in the run up to the French presidential elections, just after the AUKUS spat. So he will champion European strategic autonomy. But European strategic autonomy can only work with a strong Germany and a Britain that is involved. It's unlikely that Germans are going to fully support French ambitions. France itself doesn't want too much of a unified European Union command, because that would limit the strategic room for maneuver of Paris. And the ultimate paradox is the French would need the British to be involved to make European strategic autonomy credible. But let's be clear, one of the drivers of AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US Security and Defence Pact, was the behaviour of the French post-Brexit towards the British. In London, we regard the French as being extremely hostile. So why would we want to include them in AUKUS? Because that's where the real defence power is going to lie. Now, let me talk about AUKUS if I can for a moment.
Sure.
Give you
Of course, I will have a few questions.
Yeah, of course, you please, and jump in.
Go ahead about.
Thank you. AUKUS emerged from a meeting between the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, with his Australian counterpart in March of last year at the Australian High Commission in London, when the Australians approached the British to see if we could help them build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, because they were very unimpressed with the performance of the French naval group building the Barracuda-class submarines, the conventional submarines in Australia. They were also increasingly concerned by the capability of the new Type 095A nuclear-powered attack submarines of the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan. And they were concerned that they were about to buy submarines which were simply unfit for their strategic purpose. They were aware that the British Astute class is viewed by many as the best attack submarine in the world at the moment, even superior to the US Virginia class by some American studies, for a whole host of reasons. They were also aware that the British are now beginning, in fact this week, what's called the SSNR, Submersible Ship Nuclear Replacement Program, which will see the first Astute replacement come into service in 2035, i.e. 5 years after the planned delivery of the first Australian-built but French-designed conventional submarine. And they saw an opportunity to get a much better capability than the French could offer. The Americans were persuaded after a long period of discussions to come on board. Boris Johnson wanted a much more strategic relationship, as did in the end the Biden administration, because they could see clear benefits from this deal. And so you ended up with a situation we have today, which is in 2023, the Australians will make the final decision on the submarine replacement that they will now buy, but it will almost certainly be the Astute class successor that is being built by the British. Now, why? Partly because the British, the Australians, and the Canadians are building together at the moment what are called global combat ships of the Hunter class, which we will share. The Australian version of the Hunter class Type 26 ships are being built in the same Adelaide shipyard where the nuclear submarines will be built. And the people who run that shipyard are BAE Systems Maritime, who are also building the Astute class submarines in Barrow in Cumbria. So you had all these factors come together. An annoyance with the French over Brexit, and I had quite an argument with a senior French official over this. The sense the French were pushing things too far over Brexit. The sense that NATO is becoming increasingly a talk shop, and that the NATO strategic concept will be more a political document rather than a strategic document. That the Australian requirement for a submarine that could operate over huge distances in the Indo-Pacific at a much stealthier capability that would afford them a surveillance capability, which is very important to them, that no conventional submarine could do, and the American desire for a new kind of grand strategy in which they have powerful partners in the Indo-Pacific on one flank and in Europe on the other. And as I said to a senior French official who kept saying to me, well, Brexit means Brexit, my response was, yes, Brexit may mean Brexit, and I'm an anti-Brexiteer, but it's done. But power means power. And if you French want access to Britain's increasingly powerful armed forces, you will have to negotiate. And if you try to damage us over Brexit, we will retaliate. Now, this is a terrible situation into which we've gotten ourselves, and I regret it immensely. But that is the bottom line. We have to rebuild the relationships between the UK and continental powers, and we have to rebuild the transatlantic relationship at a moment when the Americans are tired. Otherwise, I think AUKUS is a precedent for the future shape of coalitions built on Five Eyes intelligence, built on strategic coalitions like AUKUS, which are much more nimble and agile than the kind of formal alliance such as NATO.
Yeah, fair enough. I have thousands of questions and my own, sort of thoughts about it, but I would like more to deduct things from you or extract things from you than just speaking on my own behalf. But let me maybe give you 2 comments and 1 question to that. Although that there are so many questions that cross my head now. Yeah, as you understand, I will always be looking at things from my Polish angle.
Of course.
Located on the continent.
As I do from my British angle.
Yeah, far away from the Atlantic. And here in Warsaw, we are terrified at what is happening. Of course, of official Warsaw, politicians will not admit it publicly when they are abroad. But in our security circles, we are completely terrified at what is happening. We also feel that we were sort of led to this strategic slumber of the last 30 years, believing that it was the end of history and that finally the West will triumph liberal democracy. And now it is being shattered. On top of that, we see no strategic discussion in Germany happening at all. I mean, even worse, they behave in a way similar to all their behaviors that they we don't remember that, but they always tend to claim that they're only a trading nation, okay, and they want to simply trade. But they are so effective that they kill competition and they subordinate everybody, supply chains around. This is what is happening to continental Europe. And of course, there are nations that accept it, but there are nations that don't. And Poland is sitting on the fence as well in that respect. Britain made a decision in that respect by Brexit. France is getting weaker and weaker. Russia is becoming, again, to the Polish detriment, an element in the balancing system of Europe, which it has not been, okay, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that limits the maneuvering space for my country. And on top of that, NATO is an empty shell, more or less, in terms of military capabilities, which people often deny, either by sort of ignoring the sort of Russian threat or by ignoring the understanding of hard power. And this is a very complex environment, and I haven't mentioned China yet. Right? So tell me 2 things. What do you think let's talk about the future, Julian, now. What is your, and I will not keep you for your words, so to speak, but I would like to speculate with you a little bit using, all those instruments of strategic thinking. What is going to happen to EU in this environment as a project, to the continental Europe? And what do you think will happen to this competition between US and China? And once we have talked about this, I will have more questions, okay, for you to come.
Thanks, Jacek. Well, first of all, I agree. I'm in violent agreement with everything you said. If I was sitting in Poland now, I'd be extremely concerned. As you know from my writings, I've been a strong believer in Poland and the Baltic states. You're on the front line of freedom. You are the test. And I don't think Western Europeans get that. I think you're right. I think Britain's withdrawing behind its nuclear deterrent. I think Germans and French citizens have no sense of solidarity, frankly, nor do the Brits, with many other Europeans. We might talk at a political level about that, but that's not really an issue. No one's going to threaten Britain or France, for example. The crisis of deterrence is not in Britain, France, or even Germany, with Nord Stream getting itself closer to Russia. It's in countries like Poland and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. It's on the margins of the alliance and the union where there is a crisis of deterrence. Northern Norway, Romania, Bulgaria, Black Sea region, and because of a fundamental failure to my mind, in Western Europe. And I think it's that fundamental failure in Western Europe which is undermining both EU and NATO. I just find it, many years ago. Well, first of all, when I was at Oxford, I did my thesis on British policy in the coming of war, 1933 to 1941. And I had every cabinet minute paper every day for all those years as part of my thesis research. And you saw appeasement in action. And I sometimes liken what was happening to appeasement. The irony was that the British themselves rearmed massively In 1940, we had the world's most advanced air defense system, which with the help of Polish pilots defeated the Luftwaffe. By 1942, we were sending 1,000 heavy bombers over German cities, all because of decisions taken in the early 1930s, 34 to be precise. But behind that was a lack of political will in engaging Nazi Germany, which led to the traumas which Poland suffered, the crimes that Poland suffered and others suffered, and the millions of deaths, and the collusion with Stalin's Russia. Right now, I don't think it's anything like as dangerous, but it's still dangerous because the Putin regime in Moscow is entirely unpredictable. It's a kleptocracy. It's only concerned about its own survival. And given that it offers the Russian people very little, that survival is fundamentally a nationalistic, adventurist reflex, which threatens our margins. So the EU, I think there'll be an endless debate about strategic autonomy, European Defence Union, PESCO, but very little progress because the countries are not willing to put their money where their mouth is. And as I said before, France is not willing to see La Grande Armée become part of some European defence community style structure of a European Defence Union. The Germans will talk about European Defence Union, but simply as a way of avoiding a defence debate inside Germany. And you're right, Germany is a mercantilist power. And until Germany starts taking strategic responsibility, I find it very hard to see how that European pillar of the continent can be in anything credible without the Americans. The British have a dilemma, which is if we're going to play our role inside NATO, it's in the North Atlantic, where the growing strength of the new Russian Northern Fleet joint command is posing a threat not just to reinforcement across the Atlantic, but also sea lines of communication and undersea cables, upon which much of our communications is based. So much of our effort will be up there, protecting the Atlantic, but we'll have a very small force, as we've traditionally had before 1955, land force on the continent. So where is the deterrent power on the land for the defense and deterrence of Europe, unless it's US Army Europe? And US Army Europe is getting ever smaller because of the growing demands on the US. Now, taking that together, I can understand why many Poles fear that in the perfect storm, Central and Eastern Europe could become extremely vulnerable to more Russian adventurism. It's more likely to happen in Ukraine. We've only had to look at the recent Zapad exercise and Russia's growing grip over Belarus to see that Russia is increasingly able to basically carve Ukraine in two if it's so sought. But given those circumstances, I would call, and I'm going to call this week, for what I would call deterrence insurance, because I believe that NATO deterrence and defense is eroding rapidly. And because of the tensions between the Western European major powers and with the United States, that will continue. The only way that I think that deterrence can be reinsured is a bit like the reinsurance that took place with the enhanced forward presence. The Americans and the British first, and hopefully when things improve with the French, as individual powers, reinsure the deterrence of Poland and the Baltic states by recommitting their nuclear forces to that deterrent role. There needs to be something that both supports NATO but is beyond NATO to reinsure deterrence. Because let's be blunt, we're in the deterrence business. We're not in the defense business. If we find ourselves having to defend the Baltic states, we'll fail. My worst nightmare is that Russian forces seize the Baltic states very quickly, as they would. And the first phone call from Moscow is not to Washington, but to Berlin. And they say, do you really want to go to war over these guys? And we all know the answer to that. So if deterrence fails, NATO fails.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's deterrence we need to reinforce right now.
Yeah, it's very good that you have mentioned that. But let me add my 2 cents to that. You know, as we see from Warsaw, is that we sort of understand this deterrence exactly, and the failure of deterrence, what it will involve. We also understand that the Russians will call Berlin. We sort of also understand, or maybe let me put it this way, we are in understanding that the Americans need to pivot away to Asia, and the structure of force needed there is completely different from the European challenge. We understand them, and we are in favor of US, winning and what it takes to win. But for many years in the past, we have not understood why the Americans have not declared the extended nuclear deterrence plus, so to speak, in one of the official visits. Like Trump could have come to Warsaw and say, this is extended nuclear deterrence plus, and we move forces here and there from instantly, you know how you signal through it. But the Americans haven't done it. Also, the NATO presence in the Baltic states and Poland is not completely reassuring. I think it even decouples the identity of interest even more between Poland and the United States by showing to the Russians that we are not on the same page. So increasingly, part of the Polish establishment still would like to believe in this post-Cold War peaceful era, and it's very difficult to wake up. But I think already a larger portion of the security establishment is navigating towards the completely new era. And this is a major change in Poland after Nord Stream 2 was sort of allowed in the summer.
Yeah.
Kabul was not a big thing, but for Poland, Nord Stream 2, that the Americans sort of let us down, I think that we'll feel the new force. Poland will now move to create a new balancing power and a new force. We're looking around in the neighborhood with our Ukrainian brethren and Sweden. Who knows what about Turkey in the long term? We'll see. And but the most important is that because we think that deterrence doesn't hold anymore, we will need to feel the new force. Completely new force that will be navigating all those elements of gray zone and everything under Article 5, so that we hold on the escalation ladder with the Russians on our own, okay, until the major, balancing system is broken and maybe great powers will join. But that is a major revolution in the Polish thinking, and we'll see what happens. But this summer and the starting of the autumn is a very hot time in Warsaw. Also the nature of the character of the battlefield, the warfare is changing. The longer ranges, precision munition, information domain, cyber is eroding U.S. hard power in Eurasia, because it helps them on the world ocean. But in Eurasia, closer to the enemy, it is eroding their deterrence, which means that we need to face reality on our own. The last word, sorry for this lengthy
it's very, very, very clear
comment, is basically most of us, at least myself, we don't believe in the EU force. I mean, in EU military force. First of all, Poles wouldn't like to be commanded by French, because French will always make a deal with Russians because of other things, because of balancing Turkey. France doesn't have power projection capability here, and especially against the nuclear power. Their nuclear force is not a deterrent against the nuclear power like Russia. Better than myself how Force de Frappe was created and why. So how do you want to show that they have any leverage in talks with Russia? So it doesn't work. So we're not buying it. I mean, forget it. It's empty talk. If I were forced to believe in anything on the continent, I would believe more in the German push for domination and creating the German army with auxiliaries. Okay, at the end of the First World War, when Germans won the war in the East, and they created auxiliary forces like even Poles. So this is better, and that might have more stabilizing effect. But of course, the full dilemma for these English-speaking nations would emerge then, whether we have the united West or not, and so on and so forth. So we are very pessimistic here, and more. So, would you like to comment on what I said, or add anything to it?
Yeah, thank you, Jacek. Well, first of all, I would say you're more clear-sighted than pessimistic. I don't think I would disagree with anything that you've said. My only concern is, with due respect to polls, is your defence budget is a quarter that of the UK's.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. In my 2021 book with General Allen and General Hodges,
which I have read, very good one.
Thank you. It's called Future War and the Defence of Europe, as you know. We talk about the changing character and nature of warfare. And it will include artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, in time, quantum computing, intelligent drone swarms. This is the future of war. And we have and there's a lot of work going on in the UK and the US on this stuff, but not much on the continent. And maintaining interoperability between continental European forces and the future Western forces, allied forces, if you like, the US and UK, will be difficult if we don't have command systems that can cope with the accelerating speed of warfare as well, which the Russians are doing a lot of work on, and the Chinese. Cyber as a weapon of mass disruption is part of that. Now, I still believe deep in my heart in our alliance. I still have a deep sense of obligation to Poland as a Brit, out of history, out of shared values, out of fellow democracies, and all my fellow Europeans. I see myself as a European as well as a Brit. Therefore, I would hope that rather than you being forced to develop this, however much you invest in it, will be a force that lacks the essential weight to deter Gerasimov and his team. What we need, and I call for that in the book, is an Allied Command Operations European heavy mobile force. If I was the Americans right now, I would say to you, if you want NATO 2030, guys, you must generate a force that in any emergency is an effective first responder, even at the high end, and could thus deter Russia, even if we're busy elsewhere. That's, to me, that's the true test of the NATO 2022 strategic concept. If we're serious about putting aside our differences, particularly the British and the French right now, seeing the bigger picture, which polls see extremely clearly, and committing ourselves to build such a force by 2030, which we could, by the way, that includes the ability to maintain interoperability with the US future force, then NATO will function as a deterrent. If you add that to the new deterrence scale, the new deterrence spectrum, which includes information warfare, cyber warfare, conventional warfare, nuclear warfare, but hyper warfare, this super fast machine-led warfare of the future, then NATO can be what it's meant to be, a deterrent. But if we do what we always do at these moments, and certain countries insist that the most important thing is political cohesion at the expense of deterrence credibility, then I agree with you, Jacek. NATO is in serious trouble. And unless there's an insurance mechanism, I'd be very worried if I was in Poland. I'd be even more worried in the Baltic states and Bulgaria and Romania. And I'd be particularly worried if I was living in northern Norway, where the Russians would love to slice off the North Cape and therefore guarantee access for their northern fleet all the year round to their main base. So yeah, you're right. This is an inflection point. But then I look around Europe's political leaders, and who's going to lead this? Where are the leaders willing to say to their peoples, look, we live in a new world, in a new Europe, in which the United States is no longer powerful enough to guarantee our security unless we Europeans do far more, and far more at the high end of military capability. Macron will grandstand for domestic reasons, but France can't do it. Germany should do it, but probably won't, because it's a mercantilist state. As long as the Germans can free ride on defense, they'll free ride. The rest Where are the leaders in Europe that are going to kind of face this reality and make the change? The paradox is, for all Boris Johnson's many failings, and he has many, he does understand this. His Churchillian understanding does give him an understanding of what is power in the 21st century world. It's not institutional power. I regret to say it's not soft power. The ultimate currency of power, because Russia and China are now making the rule of the road, is again hard power. And unless we, the democracies, have enough of it, then we are complicit in our own demise. And that is simply a lack of leadership, ultimately, Jacek. So I sympathize and I remain in solidarity in the hope that we can find a solution and quickly. But yeah, I'm not that confident, sadly.
Yeah, everything, in my opinion, everything what you have said and what I have added is sort of boiling down to one question, the German question again on the continent. Because if they claim to be simply a mercantile power, and the global trading system is in tatters now because of the US-China thing, competition, and Germany has been a free rider because of the US control of the global commons and the rules of the road that the US global power projection has sustained. So it's enough to cut it off to them, but then they might switch to the continental game, in those, all those grand schemes and then they need Russia and China. Maybe they are playing this game, Julian. Maybe they are not so naive. Maybe it's already somewhere organically underneath, in a way. Aren't British suspicious of that? You always see power based on on isles connected to world ocean and US. Maybe it's not a naivety, maybe there is something going on. Like Macron for sure is thinking about it. He's thinking about the space from Vladivostok to Portugal. He wants to balance China with Russia. We know that the French are talking to Russians and along those lines. What is your take on that?
First of all, from those senior Brits with whom I talk, the sense of Berlin is that it's a strategy-free environment, that they're not that clever, that the business community is. The business community, that's where the strategic thinking in Germany is. And because they're so mercantilist, they'll do deals, but they don't do long-term deals because all they're bothered about is their balance sheet.
Mm-hmm.
What Germany lacks is a strategic community. There are those, there are friends of mine that I can think of who are great strategic thinkers, but they have no power. I got myself into trouble years ago when I was a senior fellow at the EU Institute in Paris, when I wrote a piece in the Herald Tribune, which I said that then in 1999, for 50 years, we told you Germans you couldn't do anything because of World War II. And for the last 5 years, you Germans have been telling us you can't do anything because of World War II. Now, look, modern Germany, I trust. It's a modern European democracy. It's no more Nazi Germany than Britain is Victorian Imperial Britain. We're all aware of our own histories, and they are acutely aware of their history. But they're going to have to get over their own history to stop using it as an excuse for not showing some leadership in defense as well. Because most Europeans, as long as it's not overdone, will trust Germany investing in such power. Building a relationship with France, with Germany, with Russia and China, well, good luck. Whatever such pretensions in Paris, they also know about the nature of these regimes, which they cannot be trusted. In the case of the Russian regime, cannot be trusted at all. You cannot build a strategic partnership with Russia. China, only on Chinese terms. Even the Russians understand that. They talk about the Russian-Chinese relationship. It's very much on Chinese terms. In many ways, the Chinese despise the Russians. So the trading relationships, the enduring relationships, the cultural relationships, the relationships in which you can reasonably trust to have some influence in return for some protection are still with the democracies, the Western democracies. In a world in which, ironically, the West is no longer a place, it's an idea, it's global. So I would call on my German and French friends to end the fantasy that you can somehow offset an America that you really should not be trying to offset with autocratic regimes like those in Russia and China, because that will end in tears. It will divide the West. It will serve their strategic agendas entirely at our expense. The only solution is to rebuild the transatlantic relationship as the cornerstone of global democratic security by Europeans collectively, including the Brits, doing far more for European defense. That is the only solution that we have. Anything else is a dream, including AUKUS. AUKUS will be a sideshow. AUKUS will maybe lead to an extension of the Quad in Indo-Pacific. But Britain will only ever be a bit-part player in the Pacific. The days of our Eastern Empire are long dead. We are an extremely powerful European state, and we will remain an extremely powerful European state. But that's what we are, a European state. We're not global Britain. Our center of gravity is Europe, and we've got to get over any pretensions to that idea that somehow we're going back east of Suez. Yeah, we can build nuclear submarines. We build very good nuclear submarines, and the Australians will benefit from them. But that's not the same as having a real strategic presence in the Indo-Pacific. What AUKUS does for the Americans, it sets a precedent for growing alliances of democracies worldwide. So you'll have a Pacific flank with the likes of Japan and South Korea, the Quad, maybe even India if China becomes too aggressive. And then you'll have an Atlantic flank with the European powers. And I suppose to conclude this ramble, Jacek, I would like to see a 21st century Congress of Vienna that took place in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, when the victorious powers all got together and decided what the shape of Europe should be. As for Brexit, it's happened. I regret it, but it's happened. Let's move on. Let's stop interfering with things like the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is being used to damage Britain, and it is, which will only cause resentment on our part, and we will react. Let's come to a deal quickly, get the trading relationship working again, so we can all focus on these much bigger issues of Europeans building a pragmatic European defense in a NATO European pillar with an EU component for crisis management that's interoperable with the Americans and rebuilds our trust in deterrence, and above all, the belief of Russia that we are a deterrent. If we do that by 2030, then it's a win-win. But if we go on as we are now with utter irresponsibility on the part of our leaders, then like you, I fear for the future.
I have two last questions to you. Last autumn, a year ago or so, the German defense minister, Akakas, sort of proposed twice, at least twice, on official meetings, this new deal with America that we in Warsaw liked very much. That was finally something going out of Germany, which is realistic and also comforting us, because Germany wanted more maneuvering space on the continent, and obtaining this permission to build up force and providing the deterrence, defense, whatever you call it, but also understanding that the final master lord is the United States with this nuclear umbrella as a final, utmost, ultimate guarantor of peace and stability in Europe. And that would be perfect for the Polish grand strategy.
Yeah.
Okay, because we would mitigate both the German sort of pressure and also keep US in European affairs. But it was like nothing has happened since that time. I mean, that was so. My first question is: what is your assessment of this proposal, the position of Akakas within the government and her supporters? What is this sort of way of thinking among the German establishment? It was this. I would even call it the neo-Atlantic rectification, or revision, or sort of something like that. New Westbindung. And my second question, the final question, is: let's assume it's 2035. And where are we, Julian, in terms of Europe, UK, Poland, and US, China, and all this great power in Eurasia against the free world? Where are we? Where will we be? And not just please speculate. Let's make a bet. I mean,
okay.
Please make a bet.
I might be dead by then, but I'll make the bet anyway. Yes, so that's fine. Look, the AKK proposal was posturing. It was hoping for the new Biden administration, and that they could, once Biden was in the anything but Trump administration, things would get far better and go back to a kind of normal. Well, first of all, the Biden administration is now pretty fed up with the Germans for not following through on proposals. Second, I'm a member of a thing called the Leusach Group, which is a high-level US-German group. Don't ask me why I'm a member of it, but I am. And we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I was listening to my German colleagues, very senior Germans, and they were responding to a very senior US officer who explained the new US strategy of defending the Pacific and deterring Europe. And there was silence on the German side. And I said to them bluntly, I said, you Germans do realize what he's saying, what that implies for you. That if it's the US is going to switch away from two simultaneous wars to fight and win, to defend in the Indo-Pacific and deter in Europe, that means the future land deterrence of Europe is going to have to be built on the Bundeswehr. Do you understand the implications of what he's just said? And there was a kind of almost blanket refusal to understand that that was indeed the implication, which it is. The Americans are shifting their posture under their new strategy, and the Germans need to get on board it. Otherwise, with all due respect to wonderful Polish armed forces and all that you guys do, I cannot see how the deterrence of Europe on land, which is where it matters, that's where the center of gravity of European security and defense is, can be credible in the eyes of Gerasimov and his general staff. It doesn't mean they're going to do something tomorrow, but it means that the opportunity, the room for opportunism is increasing. So that's my first point. We'll see whether the Germans get more serious with the new government when it's eventually agreed, but I'm not hopeful, frankly. Now, as to 2035, well, there are two scenarios. The optimistic scenario is we've built this allied command operations European heavy mobile force. There's much more genuine strategic cohesion between the three major Western European powers. We all understand the responsibilities. There's a match between the ends, ways, and means of European armed forces focused on Europe. We can do the odd operation in and around Europe, in North Africa and elsewhere if we have to, crisis management. The EU does security engagement, manages what will be a growing migration crisis, those kind of areas. But NATO is a warfighting alliance, that the deterrence concept and the warfighting concept in the Brussels statement of June of this year is real, and that NATO's warfighting capstone concept, which they're now developing, is absolutely followed through on. If that happens, then NATO's in business. The alternative, bad scenario, is we go on the way we're going. Britain sails off with the Americans and builds a powerful navy and hides behind its nuclear deterrent. There's ongoing disruption caused by a very difficult relationship between the European Commission and the British, with the French behind them, and to some extent the Germans, that leaks over into defense. The British people become less and less willing to defend continental Europe anyway, because why should they? Because whether they're right or wrong, they sense that the European Commission is trying to damage Britain and subordinate it. Germany goes on being a mercantilist power. Macron is re-elected and has enormous ambitions for European strategic autonomy, which is more rhetoric than reality, and continue and to make that happen undermines NATO in the 1930s, in the 2020s rather, by refusing to allow NATO to accept that China may be an issue, or that NATO must prepare for future war, hyper war, along the lines that we've talked. And in the end, in that circumstance, if I'm really blunt, you Poles, even for Germans, then become a faraway country about which we know little, as Chamberlain once spoke of Czechoslovakia before at the Munich conference in 1938. We must not allow this to happen. whether it's Poles or Brits or French and Germans or Estonians, etc., Italians. We as Europeans have got to get over this ridiculous, strategically illiterate moment in which we found ourselves. Because the ultimate paradox of my position, to conclude, Jacek, is I actually believe in European strategic autonomy. It's time. But autonomy is a function of relative power, not grand French words. Only when we Europeans build sufficient military power together will we have the autonomy from the Americans to act on certain cases independently. But autonomy is not independence, and autonomy is not and should never be anti-American. It should be a way of better sharing the burdens of Euro-Atlantic security and defense with our North American allies, by we Europeans taking much more responsibility for the security and defense of Europe as Europeans from the Atlantic to the Urals. That's it. But this is the moment, Jacek, and if we don't act now, then I fear we're in for a very bumpy future indeed.
Yeah, I concur with everything you have said in this final portion of remarks. And, that was a very sobering summary. Thank you very much, Julian.
Pleasure.
Our guest today at Strategy and Future was Professor Julian Lindley-French. Thank you once more. And you all stay with us for more episodes. As you know, we cover all that is happening in the world from the strategic angle. Thank you very much.
I've been honored. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.